Hey guys, tonight we are taking a strange and silent walk together, down a path that is both deeply familiar and terrifyingly alien. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the middle of your own kitchen. In our modern world, it's mostly treated as a curiosity, a quirky behavioral glitch that provides more amusing anecdotes than genuine fear. It's the stuff of sitcoms, where a character wakes up to find they've made a 7-layer dip in their sleep, or rearrange all the garden gnomes to face the house. Erase everything you know about brainwaves, about NREM sleep and parasomnias. Travel back with me to a time before electricity, before neurology, before the comforting certainty that there's a rational explanation for almost everything. Picture a world lit only by firelight and moonlight, a world where the night is not just dark, but full of unknown possibilities and palpable dangers. A world where the forest edge is not just the start of the woods, but the border of a different, more threatening reality. In this world, the line between the natural and the supernatural is not just blurry, it's practically non-existent. Now, in this world, imagine seeing a figure moving silently through the village square in the dead of night. Their eyes are wide, glassy, and unseeing. They don't respond when you call their name. They move with a strange, unnerving purpose, as if guided by an invisible force. We see viral videos of kids talking nonsense to a houseplant, or a partner trying to arm wrestle a pillow. You would think they are possessed. You would think they are being led by an angel, or more likely, a demon. You might think their soul has left their body to do some unholy work, leaving an empty shell to wander the earth. If you saw your neighbor doing this, you might not rush to help them back to bed. You might rush to bolt your own door. Because in the medieval world, a sleepwalker wasn't just a person with a sleep disorder. They were a living, breathing omen, a mystery, a terrifying spectacle that suggested the walls between our world and the next were far thinner than anyone was comfortable with. They were a walking embodiment of the uncanny, and their nighttime journeys were not seen as random, but as journeys with a dark and profound purpose. And that is where our story truly begins. Not with the science, but with the superstition. Not with the brain, but with the soul. It's bizarre, yes, but it's contained. We might worry about someone bumping into a wall, or, in a more advanced case, attempting to send a deeply confusing text message to their boss at 3 a.m. But ultimately, we see it through a scientific lens. The air is cool on your bare skin, and the linoleum floor is a shock of cold against the soles of your feet. Specifically, it's a parasomnia, an unwanted event that happens during sleep. It occurs during N3 sleep, the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, which is why you almost never remember your nocturnal adventures. It has a strange hybrid state where your brain is awake enough to perform complex motor functions like walking, opening doors, even operating machinery, but still asleep enough that your consciousness, your sense of self, is completely offline. Modern sleep science is still teasing apart the exact cocktail of genetics and environmental triggers that uncorks the sleepwalker from their bottle. But the framework is there. It's a medical condition, triggered by stress, sleep deprivation, or sometimes just a genetic predisposition. There are stories, even now, that skirt the edges of the bizarre people who have composed music, painted art, or driven for miles, all while completely asleep. A woman in Australia once drove 20 miles to the house of some friends, all while sound asleep, apparently just deciding on a whim to pay a social call. Her friends, understandably, were a little confused. The only sound is the low electric hum of the refrigerator, a steady companion in the dead of night. Your eyes are open, but they aren't truly seeing. You are adrift, a pilotless vessel navigating the quiet shoals of your own home. There is a good chance that if you found yourself in a similar state 700 years ago, perched on the edge of a castle battlement, you probably wouldn't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see our little community scattered across the globe, all listening in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You know the phenomenon, of course, sleepwalking, or to give it its proper, slightly less romantic name, somnambulism. You understand, on some level, that it's not the person's soul going for a wander. It's a neurological hiccup. But what happens when you strip away that scientific understanding? I want you to really try to imagine it. You wouldn't think parasomnia. You wouldn't think a disorder of arousal from non-REM sleep. You would think something else is moving them. So there you stand, in your medieval village, watching this figure glide through the moonlight. Your first thought is not of medicine, but of malevolence. You see their eyes, open but vacant, and you understand it as proof that the rightful occupant, the soul, is absent. This would be seen not as a strange quirk of a sleep-addled brain, but as preternatural power granted by an unholy pilot. Sometimes it was viewed as a form of demonic puppetry, or if it had been temporarily cast out of the body entirely, forced to watch helplessly as its physical form was defiled. Imagine the terror of that idea that you are a prisoner in your own skull, aware but unable to act. This wasn't just folklore. It was a subject of serious scholarly argument. They didn't have EEG machines to show the brain was in deep sleep, but they did have a plentiful supply of holy water and suspicion. The remedies were, as you can imagine, spiritual rather than medical. Prayers would be said over the sleeping person. The room would be blessed, the bedpost sprinkled with holy water. In more extreme cases, an exorcism might be attempted. The goal wasn't to wake the person up, but to cast out the entity that was driving them. For the sleepwalker and their family, it was a terrifying ordeal. You weren't just a person with a peculiar habit. You were a vessel for the damned, a walking, talking, and occasionally baking sign that hell was not just a place you went when you died, but a force that could reach out and take you for a walk while you were still very much alive. The idea was that a demon could manipulate a sleeping body from a distance, using it like a marionette to carry out small, often pointless-seeming tasks. Maybe it would move a specific stone from a church wall or untie a fisherman's net. The purpose was inscrutable to humans, but it was part of the demon's larger, disruptive plan. The person would wake up back in their bed, utterly exhausted and with no memory, perhaps with a little mud on their feet, completely unaware that they had been used as a supernatural tool in the cosmic war. It's a bit less call the exorcist, and a lot more hide the car keys and maybe check if you've dismantled any sacred objects overnight. They might mutter unintelligibly, which could easily be interpreted as speaking in tongues or whispering incantations. They might be found in places associated with dark forces, a crossroads, a graveyard, or the edge of a dark wood. Why would a good Christian soul wander to such a place? Clearly, it wouldn't. Therefore, the body must be on a demonic pilgrimage. This interpretation was given serious weight by the theological and legal minds of the era. The infamous late 15th century text, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, spends a great deal of time outlining how to identify a witch. And such unusual nocturnal activities were considered prime evidence of a pact with Satan. Your sleepy stroll to the pantry could, in another time, be Exhibit A in your trial for witchcraft. What, then, is steering the ship? For the medieval observer, the answer was often chillingly simple. A demon. The devil, or one of his legion of lesser fiends, had found an unlocked door. The body was being used, like a stolen horse, for some nefarious purpose. This wasn't the thrashing, screaming, head-spinning possession you might see in modern movies. This was something quieter, and in many ways far more disturbing. It was a calm, methodical, and purposeful possession. The devil, apparently, had a lot of late-night errands to run, and your neighbor's body was the perfect, unassuming vehicle. In the medieval mind, the world is a stage for a constant, cosmic war between God and Satan, and every human soul is the battlefield. Daily life is steeped in this reality. A crop failure isn't just bad luck. It's a sign of God's displeasure or a devil's meddling. A sudden illness isn't just a pathogen. It's a spiritual affliction. And sleep, that nightly surrender of consciousness, is the most vulnerable time of all. You are, for all intents and purposes, not home. And when the house is empty, anything can decide to move in. The sleepwalker, therefore, becomes a terrifying spectacle of this vulnerability. Think about the evidence they would gather. The sleepwalker might perform feats of incredible strength or agility, navigating treacherous paths on a roof or a cliff edge with an unnatural surety. There's a fascinating and deeply strange fringe belief from the period that it wasn't always a full-blown possession. Theologians and chroniclers of the time fiercely debated whether the soul of the sleepwalker was merely suppressed by the demonic influence. Now, you might think that every unseeing midnight wanderer was met with fear and a bucket of holy water. And often, you'd be right. The fear of demonic influence was a powerful, ever-present shadow. But the medieval world was not a monolith of grim suspicion. The Bible is filled with stories of God speaking to people in dreams. Joseph, Daniel, the wise men. Some folklore suggested that the soul literally left the body during these episodes, not to be replaced by a demon, but to travel on its own. If you fell from a great height while on a divine errand, was that a test of faith? Or had a demon interfered at the last moment? And what of the deeds performed? If a sleepwalker gave away all the family's grain to the poor, was that a divinely inspired act of charity? Or was the family now facing starvation because of a heavenly whim? It created a complex social and spiritual puzzle. You could be living with a potential saint, but that saint might accidentally burn the house down while trying to light 1,000 prayer candles in their sleep. It shows that even the good version of supernatural sleepwalking was fraught with earthly complications. The sleepwalker was a person caught between worlds, an enigma whose nocturnal wanderings were a public spectacle to be interpreted by all, a walking Rorschach test for the village's hopes and fears. It might visit relatives in a distant land, or even fly to the celestial spheres to commune with angels. The body, left on autopilot, would simply mimic the actions of the soul's journey. So if your soul was spiritually walking to Jerusalem, your body might get up and start trudging down the village road. This belief is a fascinating blend of Christian theology and older, pagan ideas about astral projection or spirit travel. Historians still argue whether these folk beliefs were a quiet rebellion against the Church's strict demon-angel dichotomy, or simply a more personal, less terrifying way for common people to make sense of a deeply strange phenomenon. It was a small leap to believe that God could not only speak to a sleeping mind, but also guide a sleeping body. This divine sleepwalking was often seen as a form of pilgrimage. The soul, freed from the conscious mind's distractions, was thought to embark on a spiritual journey. The body, in its sleepwalking state, was simply following along. The destination was key. If you were found wandering towards the local tavern or a suspected witch's cottage, that was the devil's work. But if you were found on the road to a cathedral, kneeling at an altar, or tending to the grave of a holy person, that was God's hand at work. The same action, a different destination, a completely opposite interpretation. It's like a supernatural GPS. Your final location determines whether your trip was sponsored by heaven or hell. It was a place of profound duality, where light and darkness were in constant, visible conflict. Just as a sleepwalker could be seen as a puppet of the devil, they could also be interpreted as a vessel for the divine. If a demon could take your body for a joyride, couldn't an angel do the same, but for a holy purpose? This is where the perception of sleepwalking splinters into a fascinating and contradictory set of beliefs. The very same act walking and performing tasks while asleep could be viewed as either a curse or a blessing, depending entirely on the context and the perceived outcome. Imagine a deeply pious woman, known for her charity and devotion, who was found one night, fast asleep, scrubbing the steps of the local church. She moves with a serene and focused energy, her eyes closed or staring blankly ahead. The next morning, the church steps are gleaming, and she has no memory of her work. Is this the devil's mockery? Or is it an act of divine inspiration, a form of holy somnambulism? The villagers might whisper that an angel guided her hands, that her soul was so pure, her devotion so complete, that her body continued its good works, even while her mind was at rest. Her sleepwalking isn't a sign of possession, but of sainthood. It becomes a testament to her piety, a small, local miracle. This wasn't just idle speculation. There are hagiographies, biographies of saints that contain episodes which, to a modern reader, look remarkably like sleepwalking, but are presented as ecstatic or visionary states. A saint might rise in the night and travel to a sacred shrine or a holy well, all while technically asleep, guided by a vision from God or the Virgin Mary. This belief was rooted in the idea that sleep could be a conduit for divine communication. One of the more quirky tidbits from this era is the idea of the soul journey. Of course, this divine interpretation had its own anxieties. What if your holy sleepwalking led you into danger? Now let's pull away from the general beliefs and anchor ourselves in a specific documented case that brings this medieval mindset into sharp focus. We're not just talking about what people might have thought. We're looking at what they actually wrote down. Night after night, his brothers would find him wandering the cold stone corridors of the cloister, his eyes open but unseeing. They would try to guide him back to his cell, but he would often resist, pushing them away with a surprising, almost unnatural strength. His nocturnal journeys weren't random. He seemed to be on a mission. He would navigate the monastery's complex layout with perfect accuracy, even in the pitch-black darkness that would have stumped a fully awake person. He would descend treacherous spiral staircases and walk along narrow ledges as if it were a wide, sunlit path. To his fellow monks, this was the first sign that something beyond the natural was at play. This wasn't just a man walking in his sleep. This was a man being guided. One of the most compelling accounts comes from the 12th century, from the pen of the English chronicler Gervase of Tilbury. In his work, Otia Imperialia, or Recreation for an Emperor, a collection of marvels, histories, and strange tales, he recounts the story of a monk. This wasn't just some vague village tale. This was a documented event from a monastery, a place of learning and spiritual discipline, which lent it a great deal of credibility in its time. The story goes that this particular monk was a habitual sleepwalker. One night, the other monks decided to follow him to see where his mysterious errand would take him. He left his cell, glided through the sleeping monastery, and headed not for the chapel or the library, but for the stables. He approached a particularly fiery and untamed horse, one that even the most experienced grooms struggled to handle. The sleepwalking monk, however, approached the beast with no fear. He bridled and saddled the horse with an expert's ease, an act that would have been difficult and dangerous even in broad daylight. Then he mounted the horse and rode out of the monastery gates, disappearing into the dark forest beyond. The other monks were left in stunned silence. This was no mere sleepwalking. This was something else entirely. Where was he going? And who or what was directing him? The monks, terrified but also consumed by a pious curiosity, spent the night in prayer. Just before dawn, they heard the sound of hoofbeats. Gervase of Tilbury, and presumably the monks themselves, concluded that the monk was being used by demonic forces. His soul was pure, but his sleeping body was being commandeered for some dark purpose in the woods. Perhaps he was being forced to attend a witch's sabbat, or to carry messages for infernal powers. The fact that he was an otherwise devout monk made the story even more powerful. It served as a chilling reminder that no one, no matter how holy, was safe from demonic influence during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Historians still debate the true nature of these accounts. Was this a genuine case of complex somnambulism, embellished over time by superstitious retellings? Or was this story a complete fabrication, an allegorical tale designed to warn monks about the hidden dangers of spiritual complacency? The sleepwalking monk returned, dismounted, and calmly unsaddled the horse, returning it to its stall as if he had just come back from a routine ride. You have the strange, unexplainable behavior, the feats of unnatural skill and fearlessness, the journey to a place of potential darkness, and the complete amnesia upon waking. It has all the ingredients for a supernatural explanation. They didn't have the tools to analyze his brain activity, but they had a rich framework of theology and demonology to explain what they saw. A quirky and perhaps slightly unsettling fringe detail, often omitted from retellings, is that the monks apparently tried to cure him by chaining him to his bed. But he would either break the chains with that unnatural strength, or simply unlock them all while still fast asleep. This only deepened the mystery and confirmed for them that they were dealing with a power beyond the merely human. The monk wasn't sick. He was hijacked. He then walked back to his cell, lay down on his cot, and fell into a peaceful, natural sleep. When he awoke later that morning, he was exhausted and sore, as if he'd been on a long and arduous journey, but he had absolutely no memory of the night's events. When his brothers questioned him, he was bewildered. He couldn't explain the mud on his boots or the fatigue in his bones. According to Gervais's account, this became a recurring event. The monks' nightly rides became a known phenomenon within the monastery, a terrifying and baffling ritual. Of course, the interpretation was supernatural. This story is a perfect crystallization of the medieval view. From these real-life accounts, embroidered as they might be, it's a short and natural leap into the world of pure folklore and literature. When a real-world phenomenon is this dramatic and mysterious, it's bound to be scooped up by storytellers. And in medieval folklore, sleepwalking becomes a powerful and versatile narrative device. It's a perfect external manifestation of a character's internal turmoil. In a world without police forensics or psychological profiling, how do you reveal a character's guilt in a dramatic and compelling way? You have them act it out in their sleep. It's a divine or infernal form of justice. Their own body betrays them. You see this woven into ballads and local legends. There might be a story about a greedy merchant who cheated an entire village. In the tale, he's found every night in the marketplace, fast asleep, trying to count a pile of invisible coins, forever trapped in the sin that defined his life. This is not just a ghost story, it's a morality play. The sleepwalking is his punishment, his own personal purgatory enacted on earth. It's a way for the community to see his sin made manifest, confirming their suspicions and reinforcing the social order. When a mind is tormented by guilt, grief, or a terrible secret, the body takes over, acting out the drama that the conscious mind cannot bear to face. In some tales, the sleepwalker doesn't reenact a past sin, but foretells a future tragedy. A young woman might be seen sleepwalking to the edge of a river, weeping and wringing her hands, and a week later, her beloved is lost in a flood. Her somnambulism is interpreted as her soul having a premonition, a glimpse of the tragedy to come, which her sleeping body then acts out. This is a fascinating twist, blending the guilty conscience trope with the idea of the sleepwalker as a conduit for supernatural knowledge. Historians still debate whether these folklore motifs were purely for entertainment and moral instruction, or if they reflected a genuine folk belief that powerful emotional states could grant a sleeping person a form of second sight. It's a walking, talking symbol of a soul in agony. It's a signal to the audience that something is deeply wrong beneath the surface. The sleepwalker is a character divided against themselves, the conscious mind, maintaining a facade of normalcy while the unconscious body screams the truth in the dead of night. It's a far cry from our modern, comical view of someone raiding the fridge. In these stories, the sleepwalker is never making a 7-layer dip. They are wrestling with their demons, real or metaphorical, and the journey they take is not to the kitchen, but into the darkest corners of the human heart. The most famous example, though it comes at the tail end of the medieval period and straddles the Renaissance, is of course Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare, with his uncanny knack for tapping into the deepest human fears, gives us the ultimate sleepwalking scene. Here, it's not about demonic possession or angelic guidance in the traditional medieval sense. Instead, the supernatural element is internalized. Lady Macbeth is possessed, but by her own guilt. Her famous line, "Out, damned spot, out, I say," as she obsessively rubs her hands, is the perfect metaphor. She is trying to wash away the psychological stain of murder, and her sleeping mind has translated this desperate need into a physical, repetitive action. Her doctor, a man of science for his time, watches her and concludes, "This disease is beyond my practice." He recognizes that her affliction is not of the body, but of the soul, or what we would now call the psyche. He notes that unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. This scene, which has haunted audiences for centuries, is a brilliant distillation of what we can call the Lady Macbeth effect in folklore. It codifies the idea of sleepwalking as a direct consequence of a guilty conscience. You see this trope echo through countless tales. A nobleman who has murdered his brother for an inheritance might be found, night after night, wandering the castle halls, trying to return the bloody dagger to a hiding place that doesn't exist. A woman who has committed adultery might be found trying to scrub a non-existent stain from her dress. The sleepwalking act is never random. It's always deeply symbolic, a piece of living theater that reveals the character's hidden sin to the world, or at least to the audience. It's a way for a story to say, you can bury a secret, but you can't make it sleep. This narrative function was incredibly useful for medieval storytellers. One particularly curious fringe aspect of this trope is the prophetic sleepwalker. So, when you see a character in a story walking in their sleep, you are tapping into a very old and very potent tradition. As you can imagine, in a world where the night was already populated by a host of terrifying creatures, a sleepwalker could easily be mistaken for one of them. The line between a somnambulist and a specter was perilously thin, drawn only in moonlight and shadow. When you see a silent, pale figure moving with a strange, gliding gait through a graveyard, your mind doesn't leap to a medical diagnosis. It leaps to the most terrifying conclusion available. And in the medieval world, there were plenty of terrifying conclusions to choose from. If a village became convinced that a person was a revenant, they might take drastic measures. This figure was slightly different from a ghost or a revenant. The Nachtganger was a living person whose spirit was believed to leave their body at night to fight evil forces, other malevolent spirits, or witches. While their spirit was away on this cosmic battlefield, their empty body would get up and wander. In this case, the sleepwalking was seen as a sign of being a spiritual warrior. However, there was a catch. You were never, ever supposed to call a Nachtganger by their name while they were wandering. Doing so would supposedly cause their spirit to be unable to return to their body, killing them instantly, or trapping them as a true ghost forever. This created a strange paradox. You see your neighbor wandering towards a cliff, but you're forbidden by folklore from shouting their name to wake them. Do you risk breaking the taboo, or do you let them walk to their doom? Historians still argue whether this specific folklore was a way of explaining why sleepwalkers do and respond to their names, or if it was a cautionary tale to prevent people from startling a sleepwalker, which could cause them to wake up in a dangerous situation and fall. It's a surprisingly practical piece of advice wrapped in a deeply supernatural belief. These stories show how every facet of sleepwalking, the unresponsiveness, the strange destinations, the pale appearance, was neatly explained by a pre-existing supernatural framework. turning a medical condition into a bestiary of nightly terrors. The historical record, particularly from Eastern Europe, is filled with accounts of suspected revenants being exhumed and staked through the heart, or having their heads removed. While it's unlikely a living sleepwalker would be subjected to such a fate, they were, after all, still breathing and participating in daily life. Association was deeply dangerous. They would be shunned, feared, and seen as an agent of death and decay. Their condition wasn't a private medical issue. It was a public menace. A fascinating mainstream historical fact is that the belief in revenants was so widespread that in 1196, the chronicler William of Newburgh dedicated a significant portion of his History of English Affairs to discussing these walking dead, treating them as a genuine and serious problem that the Church needed to address. The most common case of mistaken identity was, of course, the ghost. Most ghost stories from the period describe spirits as looking much like they did in life, but often pale, silent, and with an unnerving, single-minded purpose. For generations, people report seeing a sad, silent woman in white, endlessly pacing back and forth. It's entirely possible that the legend began with a real-life sleepwalker centuries ago, whose strange nocturnal habit was immortalized as a haunting. Her personal neurological quirk became the village's shared supernatural folklore. This wasn't just a one-to-one confusion with simple ghosts. In some regions, sleepwalkers were mistaken for something far more sinister, a revenant. Unlike a wispy, ethereal ghost, a revenant was a corporeal undead, a walking corpse that rose from its grave to trouble the living, often spreading disease or seeking revenge. These were the zombies of the medieval world. If a sleepwalker was seen near a graveyard, looking pale and disheveled, and moving with that strange, purpose-driven gait, it would be easy to believe they had just clawed their way out of a tomb. This description fits a sleepwalker almost perfectly. Imagine you're a guard on the castle battlements, peering into the misty courtyard below. You see the lady of the castle, who is known to be ill in her chambers, walking slowly across the cobblestones in her white nightdress. She doesn't respond to your calls. She seems to float more than walk. Your immediate assumption, oh, Lady Annalise is having a nocturnal wander. That's the ghost of Lady Annalise. She must have died in her bed. The story would spread like wildfire through the castle, a tale of a tragic haunting, only to be complicated by the fact that Lady Annalise shows up for breakfast the next morning, perfectly alive, if a little tired. This confusion fueled countless local legends. A village might have a story about a white lady who haunts the local bridge. This connection to the undead could have terrifying consequences for the sleepwalker. A truly quirky and specific piece of folklore from Germanic regions speaks of the Nachtgänger, or night-goer. The fear of a sleepwalker didn't always stop at the individual. It could expand, like a ripple in a dark pond, to encompass the entire community. A single person's nocturnal wandering could be interpreted as more than just a personal affliction, demonic or otherwise. It could be seen as an omen, a living, breathing portent of a disaster that was about to befall the whole village. The sleepwalker became a walking barometer of communal fortune, and their strange, unconscious behavior was a message for everyone to read, if they dared. While not strictly about sleepwalking, it touches the same nerve. Versus using the sleepwalker as a scapegoat, historians still argue whether the fear of the somnambulist was a genuine supernatural belief or a convenient social mechanism. When the harvest failed, was it easier to blame bad weather and poor planning, or to point to Thomas the baker, who was seen walking the fields a month prior, and say his unholy wandering cursed the land? It provides a focal point for fear and anger. The sleepwalker becomes a repository for the community's anxieties. This didn't necessarily lead to violence against the sleepwalker, but it certainly led to social exclusion, suspicion, and a deep-seated fear that made their life and their family's life incredibly difficult. They were a living ghost story, a walking cautionary tale, and a constant unnerving reminder that the fabric of reality was fragile, and that a great disaster might be just one sleepy, unconscious step away. The sin eater was a person who, through a ritual meal, would take on the sins of a deceased person, allowing the soul to rest in peace. The sleepwalker was sometimes seen as a kind of involuntary, prophetic version of this. By acting out the future disaster, they were in some way absorbing the initial shock of it, becoming a living vessel for the community's coming sorrow. It's a strange, almost noble, but terrifying role to be cast in. They weren't causing the famine, but they were its first victim in a spiritual sense. Think about the medieval worldview. Life was precarious. Famine, plague, and war were not abstract historical concepts. They were real and recurring threats. People desperately searched for signs, for any indication of what the future held. They read the stars, they watched the flight of birds, and they interpreted unusual events as messages from God or fate. In some parts of Europe, there was a specific belief that if a sleepwalker was seen climbing to the highest point in the village, the church tower a hilltop, and pointing towards a neighboring town, it meant that war or some other misfortune would come from that direction. They were like a human weather vane for disaster. This put immense pressure on both the sleepwalker and their family. They weren't just dealing with a strange and sometimes dangerous habit. They were dealing with being the source of public panic and anxiety. Their house would be watched. Their family would be questioned. They would be seen as touched by a dark fate, and that fate was contagious. A mainstream historical fact supporting this mindset is the widespread use of prodigy books in the medieval and early modern periods. These were collections, like that of Conrad Lycosenes, that meticulously catalogued strange occurrences, two-headed calves, comets, rains of blood, and interpreted them as divine warnings. A sleepwalker's bizarre behavior would fit perfectly into this genre of ominous signs. In this context, a sleepwalker was a powerful and terrifying omen. Their behavior was so far outside the norm that it had to mean something significant. The logic was simple. A disordered person signifies a disordered future. Their internal chaos was seen as a mirror of a coming chaos in the external world. The specifics of the omen were often interpreted from the sleepwalker's actions. For example, if a person was seen sleepwalking through the fields, tracing the boundaries of the village's farmland, it might be taken as a sign of a coming famine. Their unconscious phantom survey of the land was a premonition of a harvest failure. If they were seen carrying a shovel and digging aimlessly in the churchyard, it wasn't just a spooky nighttime activity. It was a prophecy of a coming plague. They were digging the graves for the victims to come. You can imagine the chilling effect this would have. Your neighbor, who you've known your whole life, is suddenly transformed into a herald of doom, their every sleepy step imbued with a terrible significance for you and your family. This belief is documented in various chronicles and folktales. One of the more bizarre fringe beliefs connected to this was the idea of the sin eater, though it's more associated with Welsh and border folklore. This raises a fascinating question that even scholars of the period find difficult to untangle. To what extent did people truly believe the sleepwalker was an omen? Given how deeply the sleepwalker had infiltrated the medieval psyche, it's no surprise that this eerie figure began to appear subtly and overtly in the art and architecture of the time. The medieval world was one of symbols. Since the majority of the population was illiterate, stories, morals, and theological concepts were communicated through images. Cathedrals were often called Bibles in stone, their walls and windows covered in carvings and stained glass that told the stories of saints, sinners, and the cosmic battle between good and evil. And tucked away in the shadowy corners of this visual world, you can find the figure of the sleepwalker, a hidden symbol of spiritual peril and the uncanny. You wouldn't likely find a grand, central sculpture labeled the Sleepwalker. The references were usually more coded, more allegorical. On the exterior of cathedrals, amidst the gargoyles and grotesques, you might find a carving of a figure with wide, unseeing eyes, walking precariously along a narrow ledge. To the casual observer, it's just another strange, tormented soul. But to someone steeped in the folklore we've been discussing, the meaning would be clear. This is a soul in a state of spiritual slumber, walking the knife's edge between salvation and damnation, unaware of the danger. The carving serves as a warning. Be vigilant, be spiritually awake, or you too could find yourself in this perilous state, guided by forces you don't understand. These figures are often placed high up, on parapets, or along roof lines, mirroring the real-life accounts of sleepwalkers' seemingly impossible feats of nocturnal climbing. The influence is also visible in illuminated manuscripts, the painstakingly hand-painted books created in monasteries. In the margins of a religious text, a monk might draw a small, whimsical, or terrifying scene. These marginalia were a space for artistic freedom, and they often depicted the anxieties and absurdities of daily life. Here, you might find a more direct illustration. A figure in a nightshirt, with blank eyes, walking out of a house while demons or angels whisper in their ear. These small drawings are like candid snapshots of the medieval subconscious. They show us that the idea of the demonically piloted or angelically guided sleepwalker wasn't just a folktale. It was a concept familiar enough to be used as a visual shorthand in the margins of the most sacred books. It's a bit like finding a doodle of a meme in the margins of a legal textbook today, a sign of a pervasive cultural idea. One of the most fascinating mainstream historical facts about medieval art is the dance of death, or danse macabre. Artistic genre, which became incredibly popular after the Black Death, depicts people from all walks of life, popes, kings, peasants, children, all being led in a grim dance by skeletons representing death. The sleepwalker fits into this theme almost perfectly. While not an official character in the traditional danse macabre, the image of the unseeing, automatically moving sleepwalker evokes the same sense of being a puppet controlled by an external, inexorable force. The sleepwalker is, in a sense, practicing for the dance of death every night, surrendering their will to an invisible master. Some art historians have pointed to specific figures in these depictions, those with slack jaws and vacant stares, and suggested they might be intentional allusions to the somnambulist, the person who is already half in the world of the dead. A more quirky and specific architectural feature that might be connected are the so-called night stairs, found in some monasteries and large manor houses. These were separate, often hidden staircases that allowed monks or residents to go from their dormitories to the chapel for nighttime prayers without having to walk through the main, unheated parts of the building. While their primary purpose was practical, folklore grew up around them. They were seen as liminal spaces, roots for ghosts and spirits. It's easy to see how a sleepwalker, discovered on these eerie, deserted stairs in the middle of the night, would only compound the supernatural associations of the place. The architecture itself seemed designed for nocturnal wanderers, both living and dead. Historians still argue about the interpretation of many of these images. Is that figure on a cathedral boss a sleepwalker? Or is it a depiction of a lunatic? Or simply a soul in purgatory? The symbolism is often intentionally layered and ambiguous. The medieval artist wasn't creating a diagnostic manual. They were creating a mood, a spiritual warning. The lack of a clear label is part of the point. The figure is meant to be unsettling, to represent a state of being that is dangerously in between, not awake, not asleep, not in control, not entirely free, not alive, not quite dead. They are a question carved in stone, a prompt for meditation on the fragility of the soul. The legacy of these images is that they help to permanently cement the sleepwalker in the visual language of the uncanny, ensuring that even as scientific explanations emerged, the shadow of the gargoyle and the ghostly figure in the manuscript margin would linger. Now, we move from the court of public opinion to an actual court of law. What happens when a sleepwalker's nocturnal journey ceases to be a curious or terrifying spectacle and instead results in a crime? If your neighbor, while sleepwalking, wanders into your barn and sets it on fire, or picks up a weapon and injures someone, who is to blame? Is the person responsible for an act they committed while their conscious mind was, for all intents and purposes, absent? This was a thorny legal and theological problem for medieval thinkers, and their attempts to solve it reveal a fascinating tension between notions of free will, sin, and legal culpability. The foundational concept in medieval law, heavily influenced by Christian theology, was the idea of mens rea, or guilty mind. To be truly guilty of a crime, you had to have the intention to commit it. An accident, while tragic, was not a sin in the same way a premeditated act was. The sleepwalker presents the ultimate challenge to this principle. Their body, the corpus, clearly committed the act. The barn is ashes. The person is wounded. But where was the mens rea? Was the mind guilty if it wasn't even there? This wasn't just a philosophical debate. It had real-world consequences. A conviction for arson or assault could lead to fines, mutilation, or even execution. Early medieval legal systems, especially the Germanic codes, were often more concerned with the outcome than the intent. If your actions caused harm, you were responsible for making restitution, regardless of your mental state. It was a system designed to prevent blood feuds, not to psychoanalyze the perpetrator. So, in this initial framework, a sleepwalker might well be held liable. Their family would have to pay the wergeld, or man price, for the damage or injury caused. It wasn't fair, perhaps, but it kept the peace. However, as legal thinking became more sophisticated, influenced by the rediscovery of Roman law and the detailed work of church canon lawyers, the question of intent became much more important. This is where the supernatural interpretations we've been discussing crash directly into the legal system. The defense in a hypothetical case would be extraordinary. The sleepwalker's lawyer, or more likely, their parish priest acting as an advocate, might argue that the defendant was not responsible because their body was being controlled by a demonic entity. My client did not burn down the barn. The argument would go, a demon, using my client's body as an unwilling instrument, burned down the barn. This is, without a doubt, the most incredible legal defense imaginable. It's not insanity, it's demonic possession. Suddenly, the courtroom becomes the stage for an exorcism. The question is no longer about the defendant's guilt, but about the presence of a supernatural evil. The court would have to weigh evidence of the defendant's piety, look for signs of witchcraft, and perhaps even call in theological experts to debate the nature of demonic influence. A mainstream historical fact is that ecclesiastical courts, the church courts that ran parallel to secular ones, frequently dealt with matters of sin, heresy, and witchcraft. A case involving a sleepwalker's crime would likely have ended up here, as it blurred the line between a secular crime and a spiritual crisis. The outcome would be wildly unpredictable. If the court believed the demonic possession argument, the sleepwalker might be acquitted of the crime, but sentenced to a period of intense prayer, fasting, and penance to cleanse them of the demonic taint. They were not a criminal, but a spiritual victim in need of healing. Conversely, if the court suspected the person had willingly entered into a pact with the devil, and their sleepwalking was a result of that pact, they could be condemned as a witch with far more severe consequences. One of the truly quirky and fringe legal arguments that pops up in theological texts is a debate over divine crimes. What if a sleepwalker, believed to be guided by an angel, committed an act that was technically a crime? Imagine a holy somnambulist who, in their sleep, takes bread from a baker to give to the starving poor. They have committed theft. But if they were guided by God, was it truly a sin? This created a paradox. To punish the person would be to punish an instrument of God's will. Theologians would tie themselves in knots over this. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most brilliant minds of the Middle Ages, wrote extensively on the nature of willed and unwilled acts, providing a framework that lawyers could use. He argued that an act without will is not a human act and therefore cannot be a sin. This sophisticated theological reasoning provided a potential escape hatch for the sleepwalking defendant. Historians still argue about how often these cases actually came to trial versus being handled informally within the community. Written records of lower court proceedings are scarce. It's likely that many instances were resolved with a payment or a public penance, without a formal verdict on the theological state of the sleepwalker. But the debate itself shows how seriously they took the problem. The sleepwalking defense wasn't a joke. It was a profound legal and moral quandary that forced them to confront the deepest questions about what it means to be human, to be responsible, and to be in control of one's own body. It was a trial that put the very nature of consciousness on the stand. The medieval world, with its demons and its omens, eventually faded. The age of reason dawned, and science began to offer new explanations for the world's mysteries. But ideas, especially those freighted with fear and folklore, have a long half-life. They don't simply vanish. They seep into the cultural soil, nurturing the roots of what comes next. The medieval perception of the sleepwalker as a supernatural, uncanny figure did not disappear. Instead, it went underground, re-emerging centuries later in the shadowy corridors of Gothic literature, where it found a new and fertile home. When you read a Gothic novel from the 18th or 19th century, you are in many ways reading a story haunted by the medieval past. These novels are filled with crumbling castles, ancient curses, dark family secrets, and a pervasive sense of the supernatural. Authors like Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, and later Edgar Allan Poe were masters of creating an atmosphere of dread and psychological terror. And what better character to place in this setting than the sleepwalker? The sleepwalker was ready-made. For the Gothic genre, a perfect embodiment of its key themes: the return of the repressed past, the blurring of lines between sanity and madness, and the terrifying idea that we are not the masters of our own minds. The Gothic writers took the medieval sleepwalker and gave it a psychological twist. The possession was no longer by an external demon, but by an internal one, a dark trauma, a guilty secret, a hereditary madness. But the effect was the same. The sleepwalker is a figure of terror, an automaton moving through a nightmare landscape. In Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, a foundational Gothic text, characters are constantly fainting, seeing apparitions, and wandering through labyrinthine castles in states of heightened emotion that border on somnambulism. The sleepwalking scene becomes a staple of the genre, a moment of high drama and suspense. The heroine, in her white nightgown, an echo of the ghostly White Lady of medieval folklore, glides through a moonlit gallery, perhaps toward a forbidden chamber or a ghostly encounter. The reader holds their breath, not because a demon is guiding her, but because her unconscious mind is leading her into danger. This literary tradition carried the supernatural aura of sleepwalking forward, reinforcing it for a new generation. A well-known mainstream historical fact is that the Romantic movement, which gave birth to the Gothic, was in part a reaction against the cold rationality of the Enlightenment. Artists and writers were fascinated by intense emotions, the sublime, and the mysterious elements of human experience that science couldn't easily explain. Sleep, dreams, and states like sleepwalking were prime territory. They were seen as portals to a deeper, more authentic, but also more dangerous level of reality. This romantic fascination with the irrational kept the spooky image of the sleepwalker alive and well. You see this legacy crystal clear in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Lucy Westenra, after being bitten by the Count, becomes a habitual sleepwalker. Her nocturnal wanderings take her to the graveyard, where she meets her vampiric master. Here, the medieval and the modern Gothic merge perfectly. Her sleepwalking is presented initially as a symptom of nervous anxiety, a medical problem. But it is also the mechanism of her supernatural corruption. She is being called by Dracula, her will subjugated by his, much like the medieval monk was called by a demon. Stoker masterfully uses the existing folklore of the sleepwalker as a vulnerable guided figure to make Lucy's transformation all the more terrifying. Her sleepwalking is the outward sign that she is losing her soul. A quirky and slightly more obscure example of this legacy can be found in the opera La Sonnambula by Vincenzo Bellini. It premiered in 1831, right in the heart of the Romantic era. The entire plot revolves around a young woman, Amina, who is a sleepwalker. Her somnambulism causes her to end up in the wrong man's bedroom, leading to accusations of infidelity and threatening to derail her wedding and her life. While the opera ultimately has a happy ending, her innocence is proven when she is seen sleepwalking precariously across a high, rickety bridge. It's built on the old foundation. Her sleepwalking is a source of immense social disruption and misunderstanding. It's treated not just as a medical quirk, but as a force of nature that upends the social order, just as the medieval omen sleepwalker disrupted the village. Historians still argue about whether these 19th century representations were a genuine exploration of psychological states, or simply a convenient and melodramatic plot device that relied on old, unexamined superstitions. The key takeaway here is that these stories acted as a bridge. They carried the medieval baggage of the sleepwalker, the association with secrets, danger, and loss of control across the chasm of the Enlightenment, and delivered it intact to the modern era. They kept the folklore alive, dressing the demon in the new clothes of psychological trauma or vampiric influence. So when we today feel a little shiver at the thought of a sleepwalker, we are not just reacting to a strange behavior. We are feeling the faint, lingering echo of centuries of stories, the ghost of the medieval monk, the shadow of the Gothic heroine, all of whom taught us that the person walking in their sleep is not entirely themselves. From the pages of Gothic novels, it's just a short, flickering jump to the silver screen. As the 20th century dawned and a new form of storytelling emerged, the sleepwalker was ready for a starring role. Film, especially in the horror genre, is all about visualizing fear, and what's more visually unsettling than a person moving like a puppet with dead eyes? The film industry took that legacy, handed down from medieval folklore through Gothic literature, and amplified it, creating the modern horror movie trope of the sleepwalker. And in doing so, it cemented the supernatural and dangerous associations of sleepwalking deep within our collective modern subconscious. Think of the classic horror movie Sleepwalker. It's almost always a woman or a child, figures we culturally code as vulnerable. They are dressed in white. Their movements are slow, graceful, yet unnervingly robotic. Their eyes are wide open, but completely vacant. This image is a direct descendant of the medieval white lady ghost and the pale nightgowned Gothic heroine. The directors and writers didn't need to invent a new visual language for the uncanny. They had one ready-made, honed over centuries of folklore. The audience instinctively understands what this image means. This person is not in control. They are a vessel, a conduit for something else. Early cinema leaned into this heavily. The 1920 German expressionist masterpiece, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is a cornerstone of horror cinema, and its central figure, Cesare, is a perpetual somnambulist. He is kept in a coffin-like box by the sinister Dr. Caligari, who wakes him to send him out at night to commit murders. Cesare is the ultimate sleepwalking monster, a passive, innocent tool in the hands of a malevolent master. This film crystallizes the medieval idea of demonic puppetry into a stunning, nightmarish visual. Cesare isn't evil, but his body is used for evil. He is the ultimate guiltless criminal from the medieval legal debates brought to terrifying life. The film's distorted, jagged sets and shadowy lighting create a world that feels like a fever dream. The perfect landscape for a sleepwalker. This trope proved to be incredibly durable. You see it again and again in the classic Universal monster movies, in films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The loss of will, the automaton-like state, is the central horror. While not always literally sleepwalking, the characters exhibit the same terrifying vacancy, the sense that the person you know is gone, replaced by a hollow shell. This is the medieval fear of possession, repackaged for the Cold War era, with aliens or psychic powers standing in for demons. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hays Code, which governed Hollywood productions from the 1930s to the 1960s, placed strict limits on depictions of crime and immorality. Using a sleepwalker or a hypnotized person as a killer was a clever way to get around these rules. The character wasn't truly guilty, so the story was more palatable to censors, all while delivering the same thrilling horror. The legacy even persists in a more tongue-in-cheek, quirky way in modern horror comedies. Think of movies where a character, under some curse or spell, performs bizarre acts in their sleep, often to the comic frustration of their partner. They might be building a sinister-looking sculpture out of mashed potatoes or trying to sacrifice the family pet to a garden gnome. It's played for laughs, but the core idea is the same. The person is not in control, and their sleeping body is up to something strange and vaguely malevolent. It's the medieval demon, now demoted from a lord of hell to a mischievous gremlin, who just wants to redecorate your living room in a creepy way. Historians and film theorists still argue about the evolution of this trope. Has the modern horror film simply been lazy, endlessly recycling an old image, or is there something primally frightening about the sleepwalker that makes it eternally effective? The debate often circles back to the idea of the uncanny valley, a concept from robotics, but applicable here. A sleepwalker is so close to being a normal, functioning human, yet just different enough in their vacant stare, their lack of response, to be deeply unsettling. They look human, but the animating spark of consciousness seems to be missing, and that freaks us out on a fundamental level. It's the fear of the human-shaped object, the body without a soul. So when you're watching a horror movie and the tension builds with the scene of a child slowly walking down a hallway in the middle of the night, you are seeing the culmination of 1,000 years of fear. The director is plucking a string that was first tuned in a medieval village, a string that resonates with ancient anxieties about demonic possession, ghostly apparitions, and the terrifying fragility of the self. The demonic sleepwalker of folklore didn't die. It just moved to Hollywood, where it continues to wander through our nightmares, a testament to the enduring power of a good, scary story. So why? After all this time, after centuries of evolving beliefs and the eventual triumph of scientific explanation, why does the sleepwalker still hold such a powerful grip on our imagination? We've traced its path from demonic vessel to horror movie trope, but that journey doesn't fully explain the persistence of its fascination. The answer, I think, lies in a place far deeper and more personal than folklore or film. The sleepwalker continues to captivate and unnerve us because it taps into some of our most fundamental, primal fears about identity, control, and the very nature of consciousness itself. At its core, the fear of the sleepwalker is the fear of losing yourself. All day long, you operate under the assumption that you are the one in charge. You make decisions, you control your limbs, you filter your thoughts, and speak them intentionally. Your sense of self is inextricably linked to this feeling of being the pilot of your own body. Sleepwalking shatters this illusion. It presents us with the terrifying possibility that the pilot can just leave, and the ship will keep on sailing. The idea that your body, this collection of flesh and bone that you identify as you, could get up, walk around, interact with the world, and perform complex actions without your permission is profoundly disturbing. It suggests that you are not your body, but merely its current resident, and that the residency is, perhaps, temporary. This taps directly into what philosophers and psychologists call the problem of consciousness. What is it? Where does it reside? The sleepwalker is a walking, talking embodiment of this mystery. They are a human being from whom the ghost in the machine has mysteriously vanished. This creates a profound sense of the uncanny. We look at a sleepwalker and we see a person, but we also see an absence. That vacant stare is so unsettling because it reflects a void where we expect to see a personality, a soul, a self. It's this human-shaped void that triggers a deep, instinctual revulsion. It's like looking at a portrait where the eyes have been cut out. The form is there, but the essence is gone. This fear of losing control is a cornerstone of the human experience. We fear going mad. We fear the effects of dementia. We fear being controlled or manipulated by others. The sleepwalker is a perfect living metaphor for all these anxieties. They represent the ultimate loss of agency. In the medieval world, this agency was lost to a demon. In Gothic literature, it was lost to a guilty conscience. In modern horror, it's lost to an alien or a curse. But the underlying fear is always the same, the fear that something else can pull your strings. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this is the perpetual public fascination with hypnotism. From Victorian stage shows to modern therapeutic practices, the idea that a person's will can be bypassed by a Svengali-like figure has always been both thrilling and terrifying, playing on the exact same anxieties as somnambulism. And then there's the quirky, almost solipsistic fear. What might I do? When you hear a story about a sleepwalker who did something embarrassing or dangerous, there's a part of your brain that asks, could I do that? What secrets are locked inside my own unconscious mind? What would my body do if it were left to its own devices? It's the fear of the stranger within. We all have thoughts and impulses that we consciously suppress. The sleepwalker represents the horror of that suppression failing. What if your deepest, darkest, or just plain weirdest impulses were acted out while you were blissfully unaware? You might wake up to find you've told your mother-in-law what you really think of her cooking, or that you've painted your entire living room with ketchup. It's the ultimate Freudian nightmare. Historians and sociologists still argue about how much our modern fascination is shaped by individualism. In a culture that places an enormous emphasis on self-control, personal responsibility, and the curated presentation of self, especially in the age of social media, the sleepwalker is the ultimate anti-individual. They are pure, unfiltered ID. They have no filter, no self-consciousness, no brand to maintain. Perhaps our fascination is a form of horrified envy. In a world that demands constant performance, there's a strange, dark appeal to the idea of just checking out and letting the body do whatever it wants. It's the ultimate rebellion, albeit an unconscious one. The ongoing fascination is a testament to the fact that even in our brightly lit, hyper-rational world, we are still haunted by the darkness and mystery that lies within our own minds. The sleepwalker is a mirror, and looking into it, we are forced to confront the unnerving possibility that we don't fully know the person we see. So we've walked with the sleepwalker through the worlds of demons, folklore, and horror movies. We've seen them as an omen, a legal puzzle, and a symbol of psychological dread. But now, our journey takes a sharp turn out of the shadowy, moonlit forest of superstition and into the bright, sterile light of the laboratory. The great shift from supernatural to scientific understanding didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding process, a changing of the guard that took centuries. The demon did not simply pack its bags and leave. It was slowly and methodically. Evicted by the new landlord, the human brain dot, the beginnings of this shift can be traced to the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was an era defined by a profound faith in reason, observation, and the scientific method. Philosophers like René Descartes, with his famous, "I think, therefore I am," began to rigorously separate the mind from the body, treating the body as a complex biological machine. This mechanistic view of the body was revolutionary. If the body is a machine, then its malfunctions like sleepwalking are not signs of demonic interference, but mechanical problems. A sleepwalker wasn't possessed. Their machine was simply glitchy. This was a monumental leap. It moved the conversation from the church to the doctor's office, from the exorcist to the physician. Early medical thinkers of this period started to propose naturalistic causes for sleepwalking. They didn't have brain scanners, so their theories were often a bit wide of the mark, but they were rooted in biology, not theology. Some doctors proposed it was caused by vapors rising from the stomach to the brain. Others thought it was due to an imbalance of the humors, the bodily fluids that were believed to govern health, an idea held over from ancient Greek medicine. A German physician, Baron Karl Ludwig von Reichenbach, proposed a theory of odic force, a kind of vital energy field, and suggested sleepwalkers were particularly sensitive to its fluctuations. These theories sound strange to us now, like a scientist trying to explain a smartphone by talking about steam and gears. But they were crucial first steps. They insisted that the cause of sleepwalking was to be found inside the person, not outside. Amying Stream historical fact from this period is the work of the Scottish physician William Cullen. In the 1760s, he was one of the first to formally classify somnambulism as a medical disorder, placing it in a category of nervous diseases he called neuroses. This was a huge moment. Giving it a scientific-sounding name and a place in a medical textbook was a powerful act. It stripped away some of the supernatural terror and reframed it as a condition to be studied and, hopefully, treated. The patient was no longer a vessel for a demon, but a person with a neurosis. This didn't stop folk beliefs overnight, of course. But among the educated classes, the tide was turning. This era also had its own quirky medical tidbits. One popular theory was that sleepwalking was linked to moonlight. The very word lunatic comes from luna, the Latin word for moon, reflecting an ancient belief that the moon's phases could affect mental and emotional states. Physicians noted that sleepwalking episodes often seemed to occur on bright, moonlit nights. They didn't conclude that moonbeams were demonic, but instead hypothesized that the light, filtering through the eyelids, was partially stimulating the brain, creating this strange hybrid state of being half awake and half asleep. This theory, while not quite right, was at least an attempt at a cause and effect explanation based on a natural phenomenon. It was a rational explanation for a seemingly irrational behavior. Historians still argue about how much this scientific reframing was truly a break from the past. Some argue that early science simply replaced one set of mysteries with another. Instead of demons, you had invisible vapors or mysterious forces. The explanations changed, but the sleepwalker remained an object of profound mystery. The new scientific language didn't completely dispel the awe or the fear. It just gave it a different vocabulary. The glitchy machine is, in its own way, just as uncanny as the possessed body. It still represents a loss of control, a sense that the familiar human form can behave in alien ways. The demon was being shown the door, but its ghostly image could still be seen in the new language of neurology. The shift was underway, but the eviction was a slow one. The brain was now the prime suspect, but it would take another couple of centuries of dedicated investigation to truly begin mapping the labyrinth of its sleeping corridors and find out what was really going on. And so we step out of the dusty archives of history and into the cool, quiet, and meticulously controlled environment of a modern sleep laboratory. The flickering candlelight of the medieval monastery has been replaced by the soft glow of infrared cameras. The prayers and incantations have been supplanted by the quiet hum of computers monitoring brainwaves, heart rate, and muscle activity. Here, in this space, the sleepwalker is no longer a supernatural enigma, but a scientific puzzle to be carefully taken apart and understood, piece by piece. The demon has been fully evicted, and the neurologist is now combing through the house, looking for the faulty wiring. The key that unlocked the modern understanding of sleepwalking was the invention of the electroencephalogram, or EEG, in the 1920s by Hans Berger. For the first time, scientists could get a direct, real-time look at the electrical activity of the living brain. This led to the discovery of the sleep cycle, the predictable pattern of different stages of sleep we go through each night. And it was within this map of the sleeping brain that researchers finally located the sleepwalker. They found, as we touched on at the very beginning, that somnambulism arises not from REM sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreaming, but from N3 sleep, the deepest, most restorative stage of non-REM sleep. This was a crucial discovery. It explained why sleepwalkers' actions often seemed so strange and purposeless, and why they have no memory of their adventures. They aren't acting out a dream. They are, in a sense, stuck in a transitional state between deep sleep and full wakefulness. Imagine, your brain is like a house with a complex lighting system. When you're awake, all the lights are on. When you're in deep N3 sleep, they're all off. Sleepwalking happens when there's a power surge or a short circuit. Some lights flicker on, but not all of them. The part of the brain that controls motor function, the walking and moving room, gets switched on. But the part that houses consciousness, memory, and rational judgment, the self-awareness room, remains dark. This is why a sleepwalker can navigate a room but won't respond to their name, or can perform a complex task like making a sandwich but can't explain why they're doing it. The body is awake, but the person is not. Modern research has identified several triggers for this neurological short circuit. A big one is genetics. Sleepwalking runs in families. If one identical twin is a sleepwalker, the other has a very high chance of being one too, pointing to a strong genetic component. A mainstream historical fact is that in 2011, researchers identified a specific gene variant on chromosome 20 that was present in a significant percentage of the sleepwalking families they studied. This doesn't mean it's the only sleepwalking gene, but it was a major piece of the puzzle. Other triggers are environmental. Sleep deprivation is a huge one. If you're exhausted, your brain has a harder time managing the transitions between sleep stages smoothly. Stress, fever, and certain medications can also make an episode more likely. It's a combination of predisposition and circumstance. The research has also produced its share of quirky and fascinating findings. By observing sleepwalkers in a lab setting, scientists have cataloged an incredible range of behaviors, from the simple sitting up in bed to the profoundly complex. There are documented cases of sleep emailing where people send bizarre, nonsensical messages to friends and colleagues in the middle of the night. There's a recognized condition called sleep-related eating disorder, where people binge on. Strange food combinations, like buttered cigarettes or raw bacon, with no memory of it the next day. This modern research, in a way, confirms the observations of medieval chroniclers. The feats of sleepwalkers are strange and sometimes incredible. The difference is that now we see it not as a sign of supernatural skill, but as a fascinating example of what the human brain can do on autopilot. Despite all these advancements, there are still open debates in the scientific community. One of the biggest is the exact nature of the sleepwalker's consciousness. Are they truly 100% offline, or is there a flicker of some primitive, non-remembered awareness? Some studies using advanced brain imaging suggest that while the frontal cortex, our center for logic and self-awareness, is asleep, parts of the limbic system, our emotional brain, might be active. This could explain why sleepwalking episodes are sometimes triggered by emotional stress. The debate continues, pushing the boundaries of what we understand about the mind. Today, treatments for severe sleepwalking focus on managing the triggers, improving sleep hygiene, reducing stress, and on safety-proofing the environment. In some cases, medication can help. The goal is no longer to exorcise a demon, but to gently guide a complex biological system back into its proper rhythm. We have finally mapped the labyrinth, even if a few of its deepest, darkest corridors still hold their secrets. And so, our long, strange walk through the night comes to an end. We began in a modern kitchen with the familiar hum of a refrigerator, and we journeyed back to a time of demons and omens, a time when a simple sleep disorder could get you branded as a witch or hailed as a saint. We've seen the sleepwalker wander through the pages of folklore, stand trial in medieval courts, haunt the halls of Gothic castles, and flicker across the silver screen, a persistent and unsettling figure at every turn. We have followed this phantom from the heart of superstition to the cutting edge of neuroscience, watching as the explanation shifted from the soul to the synapse, from demonic possession to a disorder of arousal from N3 sleep. What a journey it has been. You've seen how a single, strange human behavior can become a cultural Rorschach test, reflecting the deepest fears and beliefs of an era. In the medieval world, preoccupied with sin and salvation, the sleepwalker became a living symbol of the war between heaven and hell. In the Romantic era, obsessed with emotion and the sublime, they became a figure of tragic psychological depth. In our modern age, which values control and self-awareness, they represent a terrifying loss of both. Each era gets the sleepwalker it deserves, or perhaps the sleepwalker it needs to articulate its anxieties. The phenomenon itself, the quiet, unremembered walking, hasn't changed. But the stories we tell about it have, and that tells us everything. About how we see the world. The legacy of this history is all around us, even if we don't always see it. It's there in the language we use: a sleepwalker of a government, a zombie corporation, to describe things that act without apparent consciousness or will. It's there in the lingering, primal chill we feel when we see a character in a movie with those vacant, staring eyes. We are the inheritors of every one of these interpretations. We can appreciate the scientific explanation, understanding the intricate dance of neurons and sleep stages, while at the same time feeling the cultural echo of the medieval monk, his body commandeered for a dark, unknown purpose. This is the beauty of exploring a hidden history like this. It doesn't diminish the modern understanding. It enriches it. Knowing the folklore adds a layer of depth, a historical resonance, to what might otherwise be a dry medical fact. Quirky final tidbit for our journey. There's a documented condition known as confusional arousal, where a person is partially woken from deep sleep and exists in a state of profound confusion. They might not get up and walk, but they can have strange, disjointed conversations. One sleep doctor shared a story of a patient whose wife said he once sat bolt upright in bed, and with great seriousness warned her that the penguins have stolen the jam again. He had no memory of it. It's a comical image, but it's a direct, modern link to the same neurological hiccup that once terrified a continent. The penguins have replaced the demons. The fear has been replaced by absurdity. And so I encourage you to see the world this way, to look for the hidden histories behind the things we take for granted. Every quirk of human behavior, every strange belief has a story. By exploring them, we explore ourselves. The sleepwalker is more than just a medical curiosity. They are a cultural artifact, a philosophical puzzle, and a testament to our enduring fascination with the mysteries of the human mind. They are a quiet, shuffling reminder that even in our most vulnerable state, when we are lost in the depths of sleep, we are still capable of telling a profound and captivating story. And now, as our journey concludes, perhaps you can feel the weight of your own day settling upon you. The stories of the night have been told, and the quiet of your own room feels a little deeper, a little more peaceful. Let the echoes of these old fears fade away, replaced by the simple, comforting reality of your own soft bed and the steady rhythm of your own breathing. There are no demons here, no omens to decipher, only the gentle pull of a well-deserved rest, a safe and dreamless harbor waiting for you. Close your eyes and let the darkness be a blanket, not a mystery.